Welcome guys to the genetics vocabulary intro. I need you to pause this slide right about now and copy all the vocabulary words onto the sheet you got in class today.
Okay guys, so I'm sure you have seen this picture in class. Okay, this is a chromosome. We've talked about them a little bit when we study meiosis. In a normal body cell, which could be a heart cell, brain cell, stomach cell, lung cell, any type of cell in your body, you have 46 chromosomes, okay? But in a sex cell or a gamete, you only have 23, okay? Now the reason for that, we discussed in meiosis, was because the egg and the sperm meeting need to make a cell that contains 46. So you need the egg and the sperm to have half the number of chromosomes, because you're going to get half from your mother and half from your father, okay? Every chromosome has spots on the chromosomes called genes. And these genes determine certain traits, okay? And we have pretty much mapped out the human genome, which means that we know which gene determines which trait. So we can kind of study that a little bit better now. So when I say that genes determine traits, that's like saying your genotype determines your phenotype. Okay, if you've never heard those words before, it's not a big deal, okay? What it means is your genotype is literally the genes you have, okay? It's the forms of genes you have, and we commonly represent these with letters. Okay, so let's just take hair color because that's an easy example. If I wrote a genotype that looked like this, okay, that genotype would be homozygous dominant. Okay, now you're asking why homozygous dominant? Well, homo means same, okay, and dominant is always represented by a capital letter, and what that capital letter means is that that trait will always win, okay? So if I have a homozygous dominant person, that means that they have two dominant alleles, okay? And if we're talking about hair color, the dominant allele would be dark hair. So this person, because this person has two dominant alleles, would have dark hair. Now notice I put dark hair over here under phenotype, because phenotype is your physical characteristic, what it actually looks like, okay? Let's go back to genotype. Let's say a person has a dominant allele on their genes, but also a recessive allele, okay? Now these two alleles are not the same. So this person's genotype is considered to be heterozygous. Heterozygous because the two alleles are not the same. There's a dominant and a recessive. And the word hetero means different, just like the word homo means same. Okay? So if we have this situation, sometimes people get confused. They're like, well, they have dark hair and light hair. Okay, that's not how it works. Genes have to win. If you have a mixture here, one of the alleles has to win. And it's always the dominant allele, okay? This guy always wins. Because if it's dominant, it's going to cover up the recessive allele. So even though this person has a genotype for dark hair and blonde hair, its phenotype is going to be dark hair. Okay, the dominant allele always wins for the phenotype, okay? Now, what if this individual has little h, little h? Well, do I call that homo or hetero? Since they're the same, they're two recessive alleles, I'm going to call it homo, homozygous. But I'm not going to call it homozygous dominant. This time I'm going to call it homozygous recessive. Okay? So that means they have two copies of the recessive allele. Now the phenotype for this example would be light hair. So, one way of thinking about this is it more common for individuals to have dark hair or light hair? Well, it's more common for individuals to have dark hair, okay, because there's a more likeliness that they could have that with these genotypes. It's like 2 out of 3, okay? Is it really common for this to happen? Well, not really, because the only way light hair can happen is if you have 2 recessive alleles. Okay, so it's only like 1 out of 3 chance. So when you look around you, you don't see a whole lot of people with light hair. You see mostly people with dark hair because that phenotype is the dominant phenotype. Okay, it's possible, okay, and you're going to learn how to do Punnett squares and how to predict this. But I hope maybe we've kind of covered some vocabulary words here. Let's review real quick. A gene is just a part of a chromosome that determines a trait, okay? So your parts of the chromosomes are called genotypes, and what they determine, the traits, are called phenotypes. You have two alleles. Everybody has two alleles. If the allele is the dominant allele, then you'll have the dominant phenotype. Okay, the recessive allele would be this one down here, and that can only happen if you have two recessive alleles, okay? And the word allele, a lot of people miss this on tests and everything, but the word allele just means a form of a gene. You have dominant alleles and you have recessive alleles for every trait, okay? So I hope that helped, and now we're going to move on to working some Punnett squares. Okay, so now that you have a little bit of background about what chromosomes and genes are, let's talk about what happens when mommy's egg meets daddy's sperm and we have to construct a Punnett square. Okay, let's say mom has two dominant alleles. Now you can use whatever letter you like in Punnett squares. It's just a way to represent an allele or a form of a gene. So let's say mom has two dominant alleles. So I'm going to use D's. I'm going to put big D, okay? So mom would be considered homozygous dominant because she has the same allele and they're dominant alleles, okay? Now let's say dad is heterozygous. What that means is that he has both a dominant and a recessive allele, okay? So now what we're going to do is fill in the Punnett square and see the probability of getting certain combinations in the children. Now, I know you learned in the last unit that mom's egg can't give both of her alleles, okay? Mom's only going to be able to give one because daddy has to give the other, okay? So what if mom gives this dominant allele and dad gives his dominant allele? Okay, then that baby would also be homozygous dominant, okay? But there's also a possibility that mom might give this dominant allele and dad may once again give that dominant allele from over here, okay? Also, again, the baby has a probability of being homozygous dominant, okay? Down here, it's a little bit different. Mom's going to give this dominant allele, but dad is going to give his recessive allele. Okay, now that baby would be considered heterozygous. Okay, in this example, mom's going to give her dominant allele from over here, and dad's going to give the same recessive allele. Now, this does not mean that mom and dad are going to have 4 babies. What this means is it's the probability of having certain type children. And if you look at this, there's a 50% probability of having homozygous dominant. So I'm going to put 50% HD. Okay? There's also a 50% possibility of being heterozygous. And remember, what heterozygous means is that the two alleles are mixed, okay? Now, if you learn this in middle school, you know that if you have a mixture like this, the dominant allele always wins. So even though this baby would be considered heterozygous because it has a dominant and a recessive allele, the dominant allele is always the one that shows up. Think about it like a fight. If these two got in a fight, the one that's bigger is going to win. Okay, so actually, there's 100% chance that the baby will show the dominant trait. So I'm going to put dominant phenotype because remember, phenotype is its physical appearance. Okay. The only way the baby would have a recessive phenotype is if the baby somehow ended up with 2 recessive alleles like this one, okay? But in this Punnett square, it's not possible. So if we were talking about hair color, there would be no way that this baby could have blonde hair, okay? The only phenotype that would be seen here is brown hair because brown is the dominant hair color, okay? We'll do another example in just a second. Okay, the next vocabulary word we're going to talk about is gene. A gene is just a location on a chromosome that determines a certain trait in your body, so a certain characteristic. Each chromosome you have
contains hundreds of genes for hundreds of different characteristics. We've actually mapped out the human genome, so we can tell you pretty much what every chromosome codes for. So we're going to be doing a lot of work in class about this picture that you're looking at right here. This picture is called a karyotype, and it's basically when scientists take a cell out of your body and they take out the chromosomes, line them up in numerical order, and then take a picture of them. Okay, what can we use these pictures for? Well, a karyotype can tell you if you have the wrong number of chromosomes, for one thing. It can also tell you the sex of the individual. If you notice on this picture, you see XY, so that individual is going to be a male. Okay, and this is a normal karyotype. So a normal karyotype has 46 chromosomes all lined up in pairs, and nothing abnormal is going on here. Next, I'm going to show you an abnormal karyotype. Okay guys, what you're looking at here is an abnormal karyotype. If you take a look at chromosome number 13, you notice that there's not a pair there, there's actually 3 of chromosome number 13. Okay, this kind of scenario comes up whenever you've got an egg or a sperm that doesn't have the right number of chromosomes. Remember, egg and sperm should have 23 each. But if something goes wrong during meiosis and you get an egg with 24, then that means that that baby will have 1 extra chromosome as well. Okay, this process is called nondisjunction. What that means is that during meiosis, the chromosomes didn't separate properly. So you ended up with some egg or some sperm with the wrong number of chromosomes. And if that egg or sperm goes to make a baby, there's going to be a problem because that baby won't have the right number of chromosomes. And that's when you'll see a situation like this with this karyotype. This picture you're looking at here is called a pedigree. Basically, a pedigree is just a family tree used to show genotypes and phenotypes of individuals. You're going to learn how to use these in class later. Well guys, in genetics we talk a lot about the rules of genetics, but as with anything there's always exceptions. So this exception that we're talking about is called incomplete dominance. Now normally the dominant allele always wins no matter what. So you should have a dominant and a recessive allele, but that's not how it works in some cases, in some characteristics. For example, I have a red flower here and a white flower here, and you would expect, well, if red's the dominant color, then all the babies will be red, dominant. But what happens here is a little bit different. What happens is all the offspring turn out to be pink. What that means is that there really isn't a clear dominant winner here. What you see is that red's not really dominant and white's not really dominant. So what do when nobody's dominant? You mix. So you have a red flower and a white flower as parents, but all the offspring end up mixing as pink. So did anybody really have the dominant allele? Not really. So that's an example of something we call incomplete dominance. That's when there is no real clear winner. Okay, here's another example of a phenomenon that goes against our rules. This time, instead of nobody being dominant, there's actually 2 alleles that turn out to be dominant. And when you're both dominant, there's not going to be any mixing going on. What happens is, like let's take for instance the cows that we have pictured here. We have a white cow and a brown cow. If they mated and had a child, you might expect, oh, okay, the child's going to be tan. But that's not how it works in codominance. In codominance, both alleles are dominant. So what that means is that you will have a white cow with brown spots. Both alleles are equally dominant, so they both show up in the offspring. The flower, it's the same situation. You had a red flower parent and a white flower parent, and instead of mixing, both the alleles are dominant, so they both show up. Okay guys, the last word is sex-linked trait or disorder. If a trait is sex-linked, all that means is that this trait is tied to the genes on the sex chromosomes. If you look at the karyotype, those are the last 2 chromosomes on the karyotype. The Wikipedia definition is extremely confusing. All you need to know is it's a trait on either the X or the Y chromosome.